the forum opened, and would like to warmly welcome on stage the patron of the forum, the President of the Republic of Finland, Alexander Stubb, and Financial Times AI correspondent Melissa Heikkilä, who will offer us the first of many important and interesting discussions on this stage during this event. A warm welcome. Thank you so much.
Hello, Mr. President.
Hello, hello.
Such a pleasure and privilege to be here today. Now, you've just returned from Ukraine. What was the mood music there like? How did that trip go?
I think the mood music was probably better than it was a year ago. I think there's a certain feeling of probably resolve and confidence with President Zelensky and his administration. I had a 1 hour tete-a-tete with him in the garden, and we also had a 1 to 2 hour briefing on the security situation. So the war is in a stalemate. That is absolutely clear, but I think there's a certain sense of confidence that we might be moving in the right direction. So I came home from Kyiv a tad more optimistic than when I left.
And what sort of conversations did you have with President Zelensky about next steps to achieving peace?
Well, I think the sequence is still pretty much the same. So first we need a ceasefire, and then after that, can we begin peace negotiations in earnest? And the other sequence is that we probably need a date for a physical bilateral meeting between Zelensky and Putin. And only after that can Zelensky reach out to Putin by phone to discuss, what the agenda could possibly be. But I think the base case is still pretty much the same. In the meanwhile, we need to continue to ramp up the economic pressure on Russia through sanctions. And we need to continue to ramp up the military capabilities of Ukraine by providing them with all necessary defense means available.
And it's been today almost exactly 1 month since you traveled to the US with fellow European leaders and President Zelensky to meet Trump. What progress has been made since?
Well, I think there are 2 tracks that we're working on. The first one is the idea of European security arrangements or security guarantees. And on the military side, they are pretty much ready. Of course, they have been set up and crafted to a situation after the ceasefire and after the peace. And then secondly, I think there's been progress made on increasing the economic pressure on Russia. And only last week in Paris, a week and a half ago, we had a phone call with President Trump and some European leaders. And I think his tack at the time was twofold. The first one was to tell Europeans to stop buying oil and gas. And I think he's absolutely right on that. And of course, there are 2 countries, Slovakia and Hungary, that still do that. And I think we need to increase the pressure on that. And then the second tack that he has is a thought of, okay, how can we put pressure through secondary sanctions elsewhere? And I think there the European Commission, and speaking under the authority of Henna Virkkunen here, has done a really good job in communicating with the Americans what's possible and what's not. And I think the 19th package of sanctions was just rolled out by the Commission today. So, these peace mediation negotiations, you need quite a lot of patience. Mm-hmm. There's 1 week where things go your way, and then another week when you're just sort of banging your head into the wall and thinking we're not advancing at all. So I think we're in a better place now than we were a month ago.
And how confident are you in yours and the EU's ability to win Trump over and actually achieve a ceasefire?
Well, I don't think confidence is so much the issue. It's pretty much about a process and engagement. And that means that we're in constant communication with the American administration. And of course, they have their own interests. President Trump is doing everything that he thinks is right in achieving a ceasefire or a peace agreement. And we Europeans need to work closely with the United States in doing that. One day we feel that things are going in the right direction. At other days, there's a little bit of a stalemate. And of course now the latest developments and public statements that we see coming out from President Trump during a state visit in the UK, in my mind, are nudging things in the right direction.
And why do you think Trump is so keen to almost back Russian positions by giving Putin more time?
Well, I don't think I'm the right person to comment on that. I think Trump is very persuasive in what he does, as we can see. He has been involved in negotiating a settlement between Azerbaijan and Armenia and others, and we'll see. So I'm hopeful that we'll get there, and we never underestimate the capacity of the President of the United States to negotiate peace agreements.
This week, we've seen a lot of news about drones in Poland. Why do you think Russia is doing that?
I think Russia is testing us. You could say that they test us on many different ways, hybrid or otherwise. They test us on land, for instance, by instrumentalizing asylum seekers, as we have seen over the past few years. They test us in the sea by cutting cables. And now they test us in the air with drones. And it's always a gray zone, attribution, not attribution, purpose, not purpose. And they want to see our reaction. So, for instance, when I spoke with President Zelensky, it was quite clear that the judgment of the Ukrainians of this particular drone attack was that this was a way to, first of all, test the resolve of the alliance. We can be in Article 4, invoked Article 4 of NATO, and then Secure and the Secretary General of NATO decided to put forth an Eastern sentry. And I think the response was quite good, but at the same time was probably an attempt to message to Ukraine's Western allies that perhaps you should take care of your own air defense first. So, they test us all the time, and I think the key point also to understanding of the testing is the information war we see ongoing every day. And that's why I think it's very important that the security community, and to a certain extent also, the free and open media, that you use judgment on what kind of instruments you use from this information war, so it doesn't play into the hands of the Russians. So a lot of testing coming up in the next few weeks for sure.
In Kiev, you spoke about collaborating with the Ukrainians on drone defenses. Can you talk a bit about what that looks like?
Yeah, I think what we have to understand throughout this war, and for understandable reasons, I think a lot of people have felt that this is just a one-way street. So, we provide Ukraine with military and financial assistance. That's it. But as a matter of fact, what we have to understand now is two things. The first one is that Ukraine has not only the largest, but the most modern and experienced army in Europe, 800,000 men and women. And secondly, their military capability right now in modern warfare is a notch above ours. So that means that, for instance, on air defense, we have a lot to learn on drones, drone defense systems, what kind of missiles are useful where. So, I'm sure that a lot of European states, including Finland, will be doing close cooperation on drones. But on that side, right now, I feel that it's the Ukrainians teaching us rather than the other way around.
So what have you learned? I mean, if it's happening in Poland, it's not inconceivable that it would happen in Finland.
Well, I think the pattern of the drones is a little bit different in the sense that it has to be either serious malintent or serious incompetency if a drone flies, on its way to the Ukraine, to Finland instead. So, from this particular case, I don't think we can pick up that much, except that this was the first time that we were involved in Article 4 procedures on the Finnish side. I think this was the 8th time that Article 4 has been used in the history of the alliance. So we learned more about that procedure. Then, as far as the Eastern Sentry is concerned, I think that'll start very much at the southeastern flank of the alliance. So we're talking, Romania, Poland, and then we start moving up through the Baltic states, Finland, and up to the high north in Norway. And this is something that we'll be working on together. So I think we learned procedurally more than we learned in terms of substance.
And how prepared is Finland for this new kind of threat?
Well, prepared enough is my answer, but we can always improve. So, for instance, today, I had a good meeting with our chief of the defense forces and our defense minister, and we also had our security council meeting with the government today. And of course, in every meeting, we discuss Ukraine, and then it always has a different caveat. And today we did talk about drones, and then we also talked about Eastern Sentry. We still have one of the most capable defense forces in Europe, and certainly the largest together with Turkey, Ukraine, and Poland. And I still feel that we have never let down our guard. Does this mean that we have 100% shield on drones? Of course not. Then it's just a question of how you deal with it and how you try to keep ahead of the curve. But I'm in the fortunate position as president and commander-in-chief to have all the key information on security, on intelligence, on military, and on civilian. And as I keep on saying that, I feel very good about the place where we are. But you should never feel too good, because that means that you might take your eye off the ball, get a little bit lazy. So we'll continue to develop, we'll continue to work, and we do that, of course, together with the defense forces and then the government.
That's reassuring to hear. I'd like to take some audience questions here. I believe we have some mics going around. Any hands? Here at the front, the gentleman at the front, please. It's coming on its way.
Good afternoon. I'm Charles Powell, Director of the Elcano Royal Institute in Madrid, Spain. Mr. President, what's your feeling about the debate on the use of Russian frozen assets? Do you think the Commission is being creative enough? Thank you.
Yeah, I think you should probably ask the Commissioner in the next panel. But I have had the opportunity to discuss the issue a few times also with Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. And I think creative is the right word. That's what we need to do. So first of all, I think what G7 came up with on how to use the interests of the frozen assets to back up Ukrainian loans was creative and innovative. But I do think that we need to move a step forward. And we need to get Russia to understand that these frozen assets are never going back. It's going to be about war compensation. It's going to be about different ways in which Ukraine will be using them. And I think what probably needs to happen right now is that there needs to be a little bit of burden sharing, so that we cover the backs of our Belgian friends, that they are not the ones who will be held legally responsible at any particular case. And then we start thinking about, okay, how do we use the frozen assets and for what? Two observations on that. One might think that there would be a slightly more aggressive way of investing that money. Right now, it's just on long-term interest. Perhaps you could get a little bit more leverage out of them. Second, when we start talking about the reconstruction of Europe, how can we use that money in a smart kind of a way? Because that's always going to be a business opportunity also for the United States, for Europe, and for Ukraine. And then how do you use it for war compensation? So I actually think that the Commission has been creative, and it continues to be creative. And remember, the deeper the crisis, the more creative the Commission is, as we could see during the Euro crisis as well.
Great, thank you. I think we have one or two more questions. Here, gentleman in the middle, please.
Thank you. Raffaele Marchetti, Lewis University in Rome. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Where do you see the major obstacles? I mean, what is your feeling about the current negotiation? Is more about territorial issues and more about security guarantees? Is more about financial issues? And if you look forward in 2 years' time, what kinds of reasonable arrangement you may think about? Of course, considering that ultimately it's Ukraine to take a decision, but of course, I mean, you are involved in discussion, so maybe you have a good feeling.
Yeah, you know, the first thing to say is that we should always come back to basics and ask ourselves, what is at stake here? We have an imperial state which has a strategic aim of denying the basic tenets of nationhood of Ukraine, which means the independence of Ukraine, the sovereignty of Ukraine, and the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And that is the strategic aim of Russia, has been from the beginning and continues to be that. I think what we need to try to do is to change the strategic aim of Russia. And then we come to the second observation. I actually think that the issue of territory and security guarantees is intimately linked in the short term and in the long term. And by that I mean to say that I think the deal to be done for a ceasefire is to freeze the line of contact as it stands right now, with providing security guarantees to Ukraine. And then when the negotiations begin, that's a different story. So my suggestion is not, and I stress not, that Ukraine should lose territory, but we probably want to focus the strategic aim of Russia to a point where Russia is only focused on territory. That would be useful from a negotiating perspective. But I can tell you one thing, and that is that Finland will never approve the territorial acquisition of Ukrainian land to Russia, whether it's the Crimean Peninsula or Donetsk or Luhansk. Those decisions are huge decisions, and they can only be made by one country and one government, and that is Ukraine.
Thank you. We had a question here in the middle. I think this gentleman was first.
Thank you. Charlie Slunis, Pasternak, Nordic West office. Mr. President, you have spoken a lot and written about the Global South. So I'd like some reflections on your conversations. What do the leaders in India or China or Indonesia think about this? Or in fact, do they really think about this a lot?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And you know, my big thesis, of course, right now is that we're witnessing a change in the world order dynamics and balance, which is akin to the end of the Cold War, end of World War II, and end of World War I. And then we have to ask ourselves the question, what do we aim at? I think our aim here in Finland is to still strengthen and hang with the multilateral system of governance of international institutions, rules and norms that were established after World War II. And then we ask how we do that. Well, we do that by giving agency to the Global South, which doesn't feel that it has that. The likes of India, Indonesia, you know, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, et cetera, because if you give agency to a player, then they're more likely to deal with that. Because I don't think anyone will benefit from a transactional world. You know, transactions take you to a certain place until you hit a wall, and sometimes you end up in a corner from which you really can't get out. So I've had lately conversations with Prime Minister Modi and President Ramaphosa, and the only conversation that we have is basically about the situation in Ukraine. And I do think that it would be good to see them more involved. For instance, President Ramaphosa, who was a good friend of President Martti Ahtisaari and a peace mediator, understands peace. India has a geopolitical stake in this, so we should get them involved in one way or another. The final point that I still want to make, that I think one of the keys to peace, because there are many, is held by China, because China has such a strong stronghold on Russia at the moment. So I think also, if I take a lesson from Martti Ahtisaari, fully understanding that not everyone can be involved in peace negotiations, but if there was a stake in the peace negotiations from India, from South Africa, for instance, Brazil, and then China, perhaps that could nudge us towards peace.
Thank you, Mr. President. A final question from me. You're heading to New York next week for the UN General Assembly.
Tomorrow, actually.
Tomorrow, excellent.
Yeah.
Where you will meet President Trump. What is your message to him?
Well, I think the UN week is always important. So my first message is that please, the United States, stay engaged in the United Nations, that it's a very useful multilateral fora for settling issues and settling peace. And of course, then, the second message is always going to be about Ukraine. But there, I come from a small country, so we should never inflate our capacity to influence big players. The big players decide. I mean, that's just the reality. So I think, therefore, it's more for me to go and question that, or ask the question from President Trump, okay, what do you think we should do next? And if next means putting more financial pressure on Russia, if next means giving more military aid to Ukraine, if next means stopping Europeans buying oil and gas from Russia, I think we've made advancements. So I think we are looking at an interesting week. I know that the debate will be quite a lot on the Middle East and Palestine and two-state solution. But from a Finnish perspective, I think we should focus a lot on what's going on in Ukraine. And we'll see what the President of the United States does. The final point that I make here is that since President Trump came into office, we have tried every day, every week to find a solution. We're not there yet, but I do believe that the only person who really has the capacity to end this war quickly is President Trump, and anything that moves him in that direction would be of course welcome.
Thank you so much, Mr. President.
Thank you.
Thank you again. And next up, it is my great privilege to welcome Executive Vice President for European Tech Sovereignty, Security and Democracy, Henna Virkkunen. Hey, welcome, welcome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now, you have quite the profile, tech sovereignty, security and democracy, at a very pivotal time in European politics. How do you see your role and the EU's role right now?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting portfolio, of course, when we look at the times we are living now, because we see that technology and security and democracy, they are very much interlinked. And of course, technologies, they are very important to our security and democracy, but they can be also used against us. So especially when I look the landscape and threat landscape around us, we see that, of course, now we are especially supporting our member states in the European Union to boost investments to defense industry. But also, at the same time, we have to be prepared for many different kinds of threats. For example, to protect our external borders, also to protect our critical infrastructure, to be prepared when it comes to cybersecurity, and also support and defend our democracy, because our democracies are also very much under attack. And nowadays we see also that European Union, we have been very open for international investments and for businesses, and our industry, they have very global value chains. But nowadays we see that all these dependencies, they can be also weaponized against us. And that's why it's so important that we are building up our own capacities in critical technologies, that we make sure that we are not dependent on one third country or one company when it comes to some critical services, critical materials, critical infrastructure, that we have always capacity in all circumstances, also operate ourselves. but also that we have like-minded partners, because we don't think that anyone can be competitive and strong alone. So we also need partners when it comes to technologies and security.
Brilliant. And what sort of lessons have you learned from the Ukrainian war?
When it comes to technologies, of course, now there is a lot we can learn from Ukraine and the innovation cycle. Of course, it's something that is amazing in Ukraine, and also the productivity, how they are producing new equipments and all the investments they have done to defense capacity, and especially to new technologies. And of course, the unmanned vehicles, drones, they are playing nowadays a very big role in the battlefield. And this is something that we have to now also very much study from the European side when we are investing to our defense capabilities, especially the drones. Of course, it's a new element, and the innovation cycle, it's just a few weeks always. So the battlefield is also like a test bed all the time for new innovations, and that's why it's important that we are also present there, and we are learning all the time, every day, what is happening there, that we are also able to invest to these new technologies when we are making now big decisions. So I'm very, of course, happy about it, that now finally our European member states, they are investing heavily to defense industry. So 2 years ago, our European member states, they were investing 70 billion, a little bit more than 70 billion to new investments in defense. Last year, it was already more than 100 billion, and I'm expecting that in this year, it will be even bigger amount of money. And this is also, at the same time, good news for our competitiveness and for our technologies, because nowadays also defense industry and new technologies, they are going very much hand in hand. And when we look critical technologies where we need our own capacity, AI, semiconductors, quantum technologies, cybersecurity, they are naturally very dual-use technologies also. So in the same time, when we are now investing to defense industry, it's also a great boost for our technologies and critical capacities in there.
Excellent. And in the State of the Union address, the European Commission announced a new plan for drones in the eastern flank. Can you tell us a bit about what that looks like and what we can expect?
Yes, we are working now on that together with member states, especially eastern border member states, because our member states in eastern border, of course, they are very much under pressure all the time from Russian side, and they have been preparing for decades. And defense industry is also in a very good level already. But now we are very much listening to ideas that our eastern member states are having when it comes to protection of our eastern border, and also on this drone wall, and what kind of new technologies we should use together, and how we could be able to protect our eastern border. So it's very much also about cybersecurity, about critical infrastructure, but also defending, for example, when it comes to drones. So in 1 month time, we are supposed to adopt a roadmap on our defense readiness from the European Commission side. So I'm preparing that together with Kaja Kallas. And now we are listening also to ideas from our eastern countries, that how we could now really boost investments also in this sector.
And the EU just decided on a new 150 billion euro defense plan. What is the vision there? What do you hope to achieve? And what will this Europe of defense look like?
That is the case in the European Union, that the defense policy, it's a competence of the member states, but also European Union can do a lot when it comes to defense. And especially we have been focusing very much to funding part and supporting member states now when they have to finance these very big investments in defense. So we were giving more flexibility on the budgetary rules for member states to allow them invest more to defense, but also we proposed this new instrument, safe loan, 150 billion for member states. And the idea is really to support member states now to invest more into defense, but also invest more together, because still it's a challenge often that European member states, they are making their own decisions when they are investing to defense, and they are making decisions alone. And so we are trying to support that kind of structure, that member states are more coordinating together, and they are also buying more together and buying more European. So this is also one of the really obligations on this loan, that 75% of the components, they has to come from Europe. But the safe loan, 150 billion, is also an instrument that member states can use also to support Ukraine. So the production in Ukraine, or then they can produce equipments, military equipments in the European Union side, and then export them to Ukraine. And member states were very interested in to use this loan. So 19 member states expressed their interest, and just in last week we pre-allocated this funding among our member states. And 13 member states already informed that they are planning to use this safe loan to support Ukraine. And of course this is very promising, because what is happening in Ukraine, it's the most crucial, of course, aspect of our security in the European Union for the coming years.
An interesting element of that is the attempt to reduce tech dependency, I guess, on foreign tech. US, China come to mind. I mean, is the EU too reliant, and how realistic is it to purchase only European when it comes to these cutting-edge, powerful technologies?
We have been very open for businesses and for investments from third countries. And when we look our technology, the whole stack, 80% of our technologies is coming outside of European Union. So this figure already, it shows that it's not realistic to think that in the coming years we could produce everything by our own. And we are not even planning that. So we want to make sure that we are now focusing to critical fields. So we are looking, for example, our critical infrastructure. We don't want that we have high-risk vendors there. So we should use only trusted vendors in our critical infrastructures, in our 5G networks, in our ICT networks, also when we look our energy, for example, also some parts of our transport sector. But then also we are focusing to certain technologies where we see that these are very critical for our economy, for our security and for the future, because those countries and continents who has the capability in AI, in quantum technologies, in semiconductors, they are very much, of course, leading the economy, dominating the economy in the coming years and decades, and they have also power when it comes to security. So security and also to capacity in technologies, they are very much interlinked. And that's why we are now focusing especially on those technologies to make sure that we have our own capacity there. But in the same time, we are also working with the like-minded partners. USA has been Europe's main partner in security and economy, also in technologies for decades. But we have a digital partnership also with Japan, with Singapore, with South Korea, with Canada, with UK. We are working again more closely. We're working with Australia. So we have many like-minded partners who are working with us in technological field.
Now you mentioned AI, which is obviously a very powerful dual-use technology. And it seems like the Commission's approach to it has sort of changed in the past few years, right? A few years ago, it was all about regulating this ethical vision, and now the AI Act seems to be stalling or maybe even withdrawn. I mean, what happened there, and does that mean the Commission has a different approach now that we are in this security situation?
We are not planning to withdraw our rules, so we want to make sure that in Europe we have a safe and fair and democratic environment also in digital environment, and this covers also AI, because we want to make sure that our citizens, they can also trust to these technologies. So for example, when AI is used in the hospitals, for example, that our citizens can trust that these systems, they are meeting certain standards and they have been tested before they are entering to the markets. But the main point from our side is now, when we speak about technology, is really to make sure that Europe is a place to innovate and investment. And that's why that is the main angle now also in our communication and how we are now enforcing the rules, that we want to implement rules, in a very innovation-friendly manner. And also we are now very committed to make Europe faster and easier for the businesses, because we are often facing criticism that Europe is too slowly and bureaucratic. And we have to boost the competitiveness of our businesses if we want to be stronger in technologies, if we want to be stronger also in defense. Europe has to be an attractive place for investments and innovation. So that's why we are simplifying the processes. Also, we are making Europe easier and faster for the businesses. But the main principles, what we have set in our rules, fair, democratic, safe environment, that these we are not going to roll back.
Thank you. We have time for some audience questions now. Same drill as before. Mics are going around the room. Here, gentleman in the middle, and then the lady on my left. Where are the mics? Okay. Can you speak up and I'll... Oh, they're coming.
Thank you. Charles Lunis, Pasternak, Nordic West office. I'd just be curious, in a realistic timeline, when we're going to have a genuine digital one market in Europe?
That is a very, very good question. You know that on this week we had also a one-year anniversary of Mario Draghi's competitiveness report, and he was also a little bit like whipping us that we haven't been fast enough, even that we have done a lot in the first 9 months in the office as a new commission. But it's clear that if we want to be more competitive, if we want to really boost investment and innovations in the European Union, we need to use also to full potential of our single market. And when we look, for example, the technology field and also defense industry, we see that we have thousands of very promising startups in the European Union. We have super research and science. We have, for example, in AI, we have 7,000 startups in the European Union who are willing to train and develop AI. But they are facing now big obstacle because they don't have access to computing capacity. That's why we are investing together with our member states to computing capacity to supercomputers like Lumi in Kajaani, and we will have 5 times more computing capacity in 1 year time. And we will give access to our startups and researchers to train AI. But then the next step is really that how our startups, how they can get access to capital in the European Union. It's a big obstacle for them. And also really access to markets, because often we have 27 different frameworks in the European Union. And this is the main reason why so big part of our startups, they are moving to USA to scale up their business. So annually, often more startups are created in the European Union than in the USA side. But only 8% of the scale-ups are in the European Union and 60% in USA. So it clearly tells that we are investing very much to research, science, we have potential startups, but to able to scale up their businesses, they have to move to USA where they can have access to capital, access to bigger markets. And we have to change this, and we have to change this very fast.
Thank you. We had a question here at the front and then all the way at the back after.
Thank you, Vice President. And maybe building up on your last comment. So Niina Hyvärinen, Aalto University, a lot of the value is created in higher layers, in use cases, in services, in applications. And you were talking about the critical infrastructures and technologies, but what about data? What would be your message to companies, to public organizations, which actually hold all those European crown jewels in data? What are your messages there? Thank you.
That is also a very important topic on our agenda currently when we want to boost innovations and investments in the European Union, also especially use of AI. We are currently now finalizing our Apply AI strategy. We will adopt it in October. And there we are now looking specific sector where we see that we have huge potential in the European Union. And we are looking really what kind of actions we can take in the European level to now support their actions to uptake and apply AI, because we see that there's many fields where we can be very strong in the European Union when we are bringing together our AI developers and the traditional industries, for example. But the important obstacle is also access to data and how to get that kind of high quality data sets. And it's one of the main topics around these AI factories we are now building together with 13 member states, and one is really in Finland, Lumi AI factory. We want to bring together not only computing capacity, but also high quality data sets and talented people and AI researchers and startups. So that's the idea around AI factories. And also in this autumn, I will also present our data union strategy, where we are trying to really also make it easier and simpler for the data users also to use the data, because often we have quite complicated rules also in Europe.
Thank you. And then we had a question all the way at the back.
Thank you. James Heapy, former UK Defence Minister. Commissioner, can European and indeed Western technology industries ever be sovereign if their deep supply chains are almost entirely dependent on Chinese processed critical minerals?
We are currently now also identifying that what are the most critical parts where we should be also able to have our own products, our own capacities, but some of the products and components we are using, they are not so critical. But I think it's very important that now we are focusing on these parts to where we can't be dependent on third countries, where we have to have trusted vendors. And it's not happening really in overnight, because we have had decades of policy where we have been cooperating very much internationally, and we have been open to businesses and investments, and also our value chains, they are very global. So it's taking time, but we are also in very serious situation when it comes to security. And that's why always now when we are making decisions, we have to look the security aspect as a first priority before we are making the next steps.
Thank you. Okay, one final question over here, please.
Thank you, ma'am. I just have a question regarding the startups. You mentioned, and I really appreciate that we are doing a lot in Europe for startups, but we are facing a problem there as well, because from these very talented and gifted young ladies and gentlemen, they often have no ideas about what the military is doing, how they interact, so like interoperability and all that stuff. So what is the European Union doing not to create another 24/7 approach like we have in the national approaches with armament and etc., and offering, for example, by using the European Defence Agency, training, access to doctrines, etc., so that they are not only developing good technology, but making it operational readiness for our forces. Thank you.
We have many sectors in the European Union where we are missing single market. We are lacking single markets. It's often mentioned that telecom, energy, finance are the sectors where we should create more single market. But the defense industries also traditionally it has been very national markets, and that's why we are now also creating the instruments where we are encouraging also the member states to work more together, have more cross-border cooperation also between the industries and member states to create also one single market when it comes to defense. But of course, I'm very willing to hear also more your experiences, because I think there's obstacles you have been maybe facing also personally, that what we could do also to make sure that we have a better functioning single market, because it's crucial for our future. We have so much potential in the European markets, but still too many obstacles between the member states.
Thank you, Madam Executive Vice President. And a final question from me. What advice would you give the European tech sector right now? How can they seize the moment in terms of defense and all the investment that's pouring into
tech sector?
Yes.
It is okay. I think that this is a very important moment also for all our technology companies, and many of our leading companies and startups, they are already very much involved to our defense investments and research and development work there. And we are also in the European level, of course, what we are now doing, we are trying to really facilitate the work and make sure that there's enough funding and financing opportunities in the markets. And it also comes to our next multi-annual financial framework that Commission, we adopted our proposal in July. We are proposing that we will invest in the coming years, so we will have 5 times more funding for technologies that we have nowadays in our budget, 10 times more to military mobility, so to transport projects that we have currently. These are very important for our defense, and 5 times more also for defense industry that we have nowadays. So we are really boosting now from our side also the possibilities to invest to defense and security, and we are all the time supporting and encouraging very much the dual use cases, because technologies and defense investments, they are going very much hand in hand. So I'm sure that in a few years' time, Europe will be much stronger than today. So we are much better prepared to defend ourselves. And also we are stronger when it comes to technologies and competitiveness. So I think we have been taking already important steps during the last months, and now we just have to speed up the processes in the coming months.
Wonderful. Yeah. Thank you so much, Madam Vice President.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Varmaan joku tulee antaa ohjeet, että mennäänkö valmiiksi vai kutsutaanko.
Should we? Yeah. I think we're all sitting down, but I might have want to ask the key question whether I sit far left as the audience sees.
Yeah.
Okay. I will. Because I don't see anyone
Right,
else.
so we've gone. Jana?
Yeah, no, I will. Okay. And you put... Okay. All right.
Matty.
Yes. I guess.
Ashley.
Yeah, that's okay. Yes. All right. Just the mic.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We'll move on to the next panel. My name is James Heapy. I was from 2019 until 2024 the UK Deputy Defence Minister, and now working with various defence companies from the US, UK and Europe. And it's my pleasure to chair a stellar panel of experts as we consider the European security capability and the new transatlantic relationship and what has gone well in terms of Europe's reaction to the security situation that we find ourselves in versus where Europe might need to do more. Before we get on with the conversation, may I introduce our wonderful panel. Immediately to my right, your left, Jana Polierin is the head of the Berlin office and senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Next to her is Matti Pesu, who is the senior research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Next, Ashley Rhodes, defence policy researcher from the RAND Corporation. Then Sylvie Matteli, the director of the Jacques Delors Institute. And finally, Esa Ratalinko, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Patria. You're all very welcome. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I thought that the President of Finland teed up this conversation very well indeed. He gave some very candid reflections on the way that the negotiations are going, on the level of agency that he, as a European head of state, feels that he has in those discussions. And I was heartened by the confidence that he showed that because of the relationship that he enjoys with Trump and his administration, that he felt that he had a voice and some influence. And I thought also it was positive that he reflected that other European leaders enjoy that too. And we've seen some of that in the way that Trump reacted to his reception in the UK over the last 48 hours or so. So all is not to despair of in theory. But he noted quite an important word of caution at the end of his talk, where he said that fundamentally the big countries decide. And we have a Brit, a German and a French person on the panel. And I wonder whether any of our countries any longer count as big countries in Trump's mind as to how these decisions are ultimately made, which brings with it the grim possibility that no matter how much we may schmooze and seek to influence, ultimately, the emerging European security architecture and even the threats that we face over the next 20 or 30 years might ultimately be imposed on us by a decision taken in Washington. And I think that that is quite sobering. It means that Europe needs to be very, very realistic about what Europe and Europe alone must do in order to be more able to act autonomously as Europe and to manage our own security. It means we've got to be very smart about the way we engage the US and keep them engaged in our continental security and how we express to the US and its policymakers the importance of the Euro-Atlantic geography to the US interest. And thirdly, it means we need to make some reflections on what US disinvestment from our continent leaves exposed and the speed at which Europe is responding to those potential deficiencies. So I'm going to open up to our panel and start, if I may, Jana, with you. What is your sense of European agency in the deal that will be done? Particularly, how does Germany seek to take a lead in that deal or not? But is there the appetite in Berlin to be that leader, both diplomatically and militarily?
So maybe I start with the first aspect of your question. How much agency is there? How capable are we Europeans of shaping the outcome of the negotiations? And I was also heartened to see President Stubb and his personal relationship with President Trump. But my role here is a think tanker, so I need to be more critical. And what I have observed during the NATO summit, but also during the Alaska summit, is that, yes, Europeans have been very united, unusually united, and have shown a lot of unity and coordination when it comes to nudging President Trump where they wanted him to go, but with, I think, limited success. And I think one of the problems is that our energy and our focus is very much on how to keep the United States on board, how to follow Trump in his decisions and movements, and how to, basically try to not lose track and not lose his sympathy. I mean, we involve kings and castles and everything, so we do everything in our power, but we are not enough focused on what do we want and what is basically our joint agenda. How do we want as Europeans this war to end? So I think we are more focused on trying to influence Trump not to do the wrong thing than thinking about what should we as Europeans do. So I think our shaping power is somewhat limited, as we have seen during the Alaska summit. I mean, there was broad agreement that there needs to be a ceasefire before the negotiations start. And the first thing that Donald Trump did was basically saying, oh, well, there doesn't need to be a ceasefire. And that was rewarding President Putin. So I think this is a problem. When it comes to Germany, I see a lot of ambition coming from the new government. Actually, I saw that coming from the old government as well. We see a lot of talking in Berlin about the special responsibility that Germany carries, about the role. And I think Germany actually can make a difference because the new thing now is that we have the money. And I think it's now about investing the money that Germany now basically can work with and to invest it wisely and in a European way. And because I think it's not only about more money, it's about also better investing that money. And I think there is this understanding. Sometimes I'm actually a bit puzzled by the reactions I get abroad. I followed a debate in Poland recently, in Polish, about the speech that Friedrich Merz has given at the ambassadors' conference, where he was not mentioning Poland. And that created a lot of mistrust in Poland immediately, a lot of speculation about Germany wanting now to create a European security order without giving prominent role to Poland. He was only mentioning France and the UK. And that is sometimes what makes me a bit skeptical about how prepared is Europe, and that's my really last sentence, for a Germany that has the biggest army in Europe and that is really a military power that has basically no immediate comparison in Europe, because that is the goal. That's what Merz said. He wants to make the German army the biggest army in Europe.
I spent an awful lot of time as a British minister saying to the German media that I think we now trust you to be the leading military continental power, and times now require it.
That's what I've told my compatriots, but traveling through Europe, I think actually we were both not always right. I think there is still mistrust.
Yes. Sylvia, I'm going to ask you the inverse of the question, because whereas there's the money in Berlin, is there the intent? In Paris, there's definitely the intent, but is there the money?
Yeah, thank you very much. For sure, we don't have money, but I think we spend a lot and we maintain a sort of whole defense capabilities. And thinking about the question you may ask me and seeing what you asked to my colleague, I thought, well, what can I answer? And maybe that will answer to the question finally you asked me. The lack we have thinking our defense in Europe and the reason why we feel, and I say we feel and I underline we feel so dependent from the US is probably a lack of strategic culture. And in that field, if we want to invest in our defense and if we want to spend money, and this is not just money, defense. This is also a culture. This is also this is much more comprehensive than only investing in defense and in defense capabilities. And I would say what we lack and what I will integrate in that idea that we have a strong lack in strategic culture. This is probably to integrate and to redefine what we would like to go, and I join what you said yet, what we would like to go investing in defense. And I think that's the core of our strategic autonomy. Today, we have not the strategic autonomy because we are dependent. We are dependent not only in defense. Even if we invest in defense, we will stay dependent on energy, digital and chips, raw materials and rare earths. That's the first way. Second way, we used to invest in our defense. We invest a lot in our defense since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, and that's a huge progress, and that's really interesting. But in the same time, we perfectly know that to ensure the European security, we have to spend more, better, and together. That's not my idea, that's written in all the European documents. And because we have a lack of integration, we waste a lot of money, a lot of knowledge and capabilities. And improving strategic culture will mean to think our European security together, but investing together in improving our integration, improving probably the integration of the European market, etc., etc. The other difficulty we may have in front of us is that we have different interests. For some people, European defense means producing more. For others, it means buying armament to the US. Why? Because we want to preserve Article 5 and we want to preserve the security guarantee from the US. And that's a problem. What do we want? And talking about the European pillar of NATO or the European pillar of our security in Europe may supposed to answer that question urgently. If we want to improve our industrial capabilities, we need to invest in Europe, not buying armament to the US. But in the same time, doing that, we know that we will lose the support of the US. Then that's a really important element. And after, and I will finish with that, I think we also need to do a huge job, and we began after the beginning of the war in Ukraine, and I think things are changing, and the unity we had since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, but also the support European citizens still have for Ukraine in that war are good indications of the beginning of change in our mindset. But we have to remember where we were before the war in Ukraine. We were in a peaceful region, and people were convinced that we will be in peace for an eternity in reality. And that's really an important element to integrate. And finally, and to conclude, I think, and I didn't answer to the French question, but just saying that you don't just need money to invest in defense. Another problem we had, what do you mean by European? Mm-hmm. Most of the time, you think about the EU when you are living in the EU, because there is a lot of initiatives. We put in place a lot of instruments to improve our defense in Europe and in the European Union. But in the same time, there is not any, well, the European institutions and the Commission has not the competence to do anything in defense. Then whatever it tried to do is dependent on the agreement of state and the council, and that's a difficulty also. And we can see that we are also in Europe. We may also work with the UK, that's really important, and the UK is not anymore in the EU. Then that's a sort of the institutional issue is also a big issue.
Well, I mean, let's discuss, because what's extraordinary is we are 14 minutes into a discussion on European security, and I don't think the NATO word has been mentioned once, which is interesting in itself. Matti, I'm going to throw this your way. I served in a government that delivered Brexit, although I voted Remain. But as a defence minister, it's blindingly obvious to me that the European Union has a really fundamental role in underpinning European defence, whether or not it actually is people going over the ramparts, carrying the EU flag, and being the active defenders in its own right, discuss. But that tension of NATO delivering the force, the EU mobilising industry, making sure that all the military mobility is as it should be, that supply chains are resilient, that the economic and diplomatic levers are pulled on behalf of Europe, seems to be exactly where the EU should be. Matti, we've explored briefly UK, French, German leadership of a European security architecture. The missing bit of the discussion is the EU and NATO. Coming from a country that has recently joined NATO and therefore must be full of enthusiasm for the alliance, what are your reflections?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, and on my behalf as well, welcome to Helsinki Security Forum. What a staple club it is, I must say, from Finland's perspective. So it's been, let's say, quite eventful 2 years, despite the fact that the Finnish integration has proceeded quite well. What we've seen so far and what we've witnessed in The Hague, that there is clearly now a new trend, and there are new buzzwords going around in capitals, such as burden shifting. But I think that seems to be the direction set in motion by the Trump administration. And for us Europeans, what it means first and foremost, it's taking more responsibility in conventional security. That's what also the Americans have underscored, that Europe must step up in conventional security. And that's not easy for several reasons. For example, well, first, like the Americans have maintained quite robust and significant forward presence after the Second World War. And it's been also like an embodiment of that US commitment and even US nuclear deterrence, that there's been a strong link between nuclear deterrence and conventional deterrence. If the US decides to decrease its foothold, and if Europe will take the primary role in conventional security, what does it mean for the US commitment if they are less present in Europe? That's a big question. Another question, and here I'd like to react to points made by Sylvie and Jana about European defense and what it means for the Europeans to step up in NATO. And we've talked about money, and I don't want to belittle the like very financial challenges, but sometimes it feels that the money is the easy part, because we're like facing systemic changes that go far beyond like procurement. We were talking about like real operational planning, total defense, security of supply, civilian defense, and even the reintroduction of conscription as a fourth generation tool. And with regard to these questions, I think here we enter the realm of legitimacy, do citizens across Europe see such moves as legitimate? Is there sufficient long-term commitment to build and sustain such systems? And the fundamental question here, I believe, is that you really can't mobilize a society that hasn't been convinced that it's at risk. And does the majority of Europeans really think that we're at risk? And this is also absolutely instrumental, like a fundamental factor underpinning European defense efforts in the future.
But before I move on, I'd like to come to Ita in a second just to get a reflection from the industrial perspective. But why, 11 years after the annexation of Crimea, 3 years after the renewal of the war against Ukraine at large, why does that public perception still lag behind? Why are treasuries and ministries for finance still not opening up the purse strings and spending the money with the urgency that the geopolitics seem to demand?
Yeah, there's a difference whether you ramp up because of an existential threat or due to alliance solidarity. Of course, alliance solidarity is fine. And that's important, but there's a strong link between like a nation's exposure to threat and its investments in security, and still say that the majority of the European countries perhaps do not feel exposed, sufficiently exposed to the threat from Russia. This is not the question here in the front line, but elsewhere it may be, and coming back to the point that you really can't invest for a danger that you don't necessarily feel. So I think that's the core problem and a challenge.
So I want to pick up on something that Sylvie said with you, because I've heard it reflected often that the US gets effectively much more hardware for the money it spends because it spends money on fewer models. There are fewer fighter jets in the US Air Force fleet. There are fewer vehicles in the US Air Force Army. The challenge is in Europe that it's not a very popular argument if we say, well, let's build all ships with BAE systems, let's build all planes with Safran, and let's build all tanks with Rheinmetall, because every country necessarily wants to preserve its own industry. You clearly probably agree with the latter argument. So how do we pick up on Sylvie's challenge? How do we cooperate in terms of defence procurement and defence manufacture, whilst recognising that EU member states and the UK will vigorously defend their own national industries and want those national industries to get a slice of the European defence spending pie?
Maybe I'll just start saying that during the ending of the Cold War, if it ever ended, but actually the defence industry wasn't really growing. And that was a time when the European protectionism really started when it comes to defense material. Now clearly, and actually, unfortunately, where that always leads is that less performance, which is compensated by higher prices. So a very, very bad equation. Now, a more dramatic consequence of that one is Ukraine, unfortunately, is now paying a certain price. If we take field guns, artillery, depending upon how one counts that, US has maximum 2 different systems. Europe has, nobody knows exactly, between 15 or 20. And even with the same caliber, slightly different ammunition, so that the original equipment manufacturers have protected their chains. So I think that's a problem. What the militaries have been talking about for a long, long time is interoperability. What we also need to understand is interchangeability, which actually means that the more we have common parts and spare parts and so forth, so they are naturally, they are obvious advantages to that one. What the industry has realized, and I think the picture is not as grim as one might think. I think the industry cooperation has been there for a long, long time. So it's only the tip of the iceberg who is the final assembler or producer of certain equipment. there's a huge chain, a supply chain beneath. Even the biggest companies in the world are not self-sufficient. So there is this cooperation going on. How to tackle certain things over here for sure. So I think that comes to EU regulation, and now also good news is that the new European instruments in when it comes to financing and so forth. So there are certain rules and regulations what needs to be done, and there is a number of already successful joint programs when it comes to the EU. I think. And the industry understands this, for sure. So at the end of the day, so I think we've heard political speeches or not, we've read papers more or less for at least 3.5 years. Enough talk, enough papers, not enough action. So those decisions are still pending. And despite of all of these obstacles, so the industries the industry is cooperating. I also want to underline one, sort of a blink of a bright light. When it comes to the EU, any of the EU countries and the US, defense material is exempt of tariffs. There are no tariffs. There are certain tariffs when it comes to manufacturing equipment and so forth. Should there be more defense industry located in the US from European countries? For sure, that's what has been done for decades. And all of the European countries also want to have the proximity of delivery capabilities. There's nothing new in this one. Then one thing, even though we are talking about that the EU is buying a lot of US-produced equipment, that's a fact. There's also a lot of capabilities that only Europe produces. US does not have those capabilities on US soil. So there is this ongoing reliance of both of the parties, this bilateral arrangement and understanding about the defense capabilities, how they are kept up and developed. So cooperation is the name of the game. So then what we need to realize, to give you a picture. So today, Western European countries are spending slightly over 300 billion euros combined to defense, of which around 1/3 goes to defense investments. And of defense investments, almost 90% are new capabilities. That share has been increasing very, very rapidly. Now the question is that what is enough? So bearing in mind that the deficit of NATO countries from the end of the Cold War until the end of 23, if the countries, and bearing in mind that the number of NATO countries has almost tripled ever since. Still, if we would take the 2% of GDP, which was only introduced in 2014, but even the cumulative spend is, we have a deficit of $1.6 trillion over here. If the spend was on the same level when it used to be during the Cold War time, the deficit is 8.6 trillion. Now the question is that how do we move forward? So yes, there is the urgency in the industry. I think all the defense forces understand where we need to be. Then it comes to the sovereign states, what's their position on this one, and the EU naturally needs to understand how to take certain obstacles away from this one. So that's where we basically stand. But I think there's a lot of hope. The industry is employing people. And maybe one final comment. Instead of defense spend or expenditure, we need to start talking about defense revenue. Even though it might sound a little bit awkward, but still bearing in mind that there's around 600,000 people today in the EU who are employed by defense. And that's growing very rapidly at the moment. If we are even halfway where the Commission wants us to be in 2030, there will be in the ballpark of 500,000 new jobs in the EU. There will be taxes, welfare and so forth, and an additional bonus of increased safety and security. So that's where we are. And maybe making just one final note of what we need to understand, and when you just made the point that why are we still discussing about certain things 14 years after, or 10 years, 11 years after. Human psychology. People tend to take a convincing lie instead of an inconvenient truth every single time if we are not able to make a convincing case. So that's where we are.
Before I let you off the hook for now, I just want to play back to you two arguments, opposing arguments that were made often at DSEI last week. So the world's defence industry gathered in East London at a big exhibition called DSEI. On the political policy side of the argument was complaint that Europe's defence primes are all enjoying really increased share prices on the basis of really full and extended order books, that to the point that it will take sort of 15 years to get a frigate out of this shipbuilding company, or 5 years to get a tank out of this armoured fighting vehicle company. Which, of course, is great for the chief executive of those businesses. The share prices are really high, the order book is really full, business looks really secure. But when you're in a race to arm ahead of a possible act of Russian aggression, it's not necessarily the share price and the order book that matters, it's the speed of manufacture. Yep. So that was the argument that was being made on the political policy side. But chief executives were queuing up to say that the defence industry is a coin-operated machine. Where are the contracts? And that, you know, for all the rhetoric, and you just made this point, for all the rhetoric, with the notable exception of a couple of countries, the money is not actually yet being spent at the velocity that the rhetoric demands. Can you just sort of unpick those two arguments? Is the first one unfair? And why are governments not yet spending the money, in your opinion?
Well, I think the first comment, I think the argument is fair, and I'm very free to say that one, because actually my company is state majority owned, so I don't have to worry about the share price at all. What is interesting at the moment, for sure, is that the lead times are very, very long. Depends, but I think, and I don't want to underestimate the complexity of producing defense material, but they can be substantially shortened. I'll just give one example because it has been publicized. Denmark ordered vehicles from Patria, made an order in July this year. The first vehicles are already delivered over to Denmark. So things can be done, and there are certain ways how to arrange and so forth. Then, secondly, I think still, let's put it this way. I think people are not focused enough on the things, maybe, where they can really make an impact on. So people are generally worrying about things that actually they can't really make a difference in. So I think it's about the industry needs to focus on industry, the militaries need to focus on those, and then we need to decide actually who's going to take care of what. And I think that this is still a little bit confusing for many. But I think at this time, so I think shortening delivery times is absolutely, I would assume it's on every CEO's agenda, certainly, because everybody needs to have revenue in as soon as possible. And the ones who are operating and leading listed companies, they need to convince the investors that actually this is not a bubble, that actually we are able to go forward. So I think that's on everybody's agenda for sure. Just make one argument also when it comes to European sovereignty and the production on European soil. So I already made the argument about cooperation. There's no way we can manage without US-based technology, and it goes both ways. But even if even if all the European NATO countries would agree that let's develop something from the scratch today, depending on the technology, so there are certain technologies that if we start today, they might be ready in 2060. So incredibly long lead times. Fighter jets. There's not a single fifth generation fighter jet produced in Europe today. The US is leading that race. So then there are these arguments about the sixth generation and so forth, and hopefully those go well. But before any of those are in operational use, we are all going to be pretty old. So therefore, in order to make sure that we play this smartly, so we need to recognize the lead times as well, or certain missile systems and so forth, not knowing what certain companies have already developed. But 5 years is a very, very short period of time, even 10 years. Realistically, 20, 30, even 40 years. So that's where we are, and that's the price, unfortunately, what we are paying from what Europe did between 1990 and 2022.
Indeed. Now, actually, deeply unfair to make you, Caroline, leave it for 5 minutes and become the sort of spokesperson for the administration. But can you share with us what this all looks like from your side of the Atlantic? There are some in Europe who think that all we've got to do is time out the Trump administration and someone more reasonable will arrive in the White House and we can all go back to building hospitals and doing lots of social welfare and the Americans have got our security again. How permanent is this pivot, and how do Americans on both sides they are and the wider public regard European attitudes to European security?
Sure. So first of all, thank you for having me here as the lone American on stage. And so I think at the risk of, well, being outnumbered by the Europeans on this stage, let me attempt to put on that hat for a second and mount a valiant defense of my country's policy. I think, James, you mentioned at the outset, that if we can't, or if the Europeans can't find a way to effectively communicate with Washington, that there's a risk of having terms dictated to them by the Trump administration, by Washington. Respectfully, let me try to flip that a little bit. I think that's not, if not an inaccurate frame, I think it's not the most helpful framing. I think that given the sort of slow and uneven trajectory that we've seen, that we've heard a little bit about from all of the panelists in terms of NATO progression to include the United States in that bucket relative to the increasing Russian threat, which really has been on display openly since at least 2008 with Georgia. I think that if we collectively as NATO, the US and European allies don't fix our vulnerabilities now, we're actually at risk of having Moscow dictate terms to us. And so I think that is what we need to really focus on. That is not to absolve the US of any, obviously, difficult dynamics that we've had and challenges, again, that we are dealing with in our own defense industrial base, among other things. But I do think that it's most helpful to have the focus be on the shared Russian threat and what that actually translates into in terms of burden sharing or burden shifting or whatever the latest terminology is. I think that being said, I am a fervent supporter of NATO. I very much was encouraged that President Trump did select another American SACEUR. I think that is a good sign of our continued commitment to the alliance, I hope. And I do think that we need to be a little bit self-reflective as an alliance in terms of where there are persistent problems, even if there is sustained US commitment going forward. So to your point about, is this an enduring trend? I mean, certainly the Trump administration has been the most sort of vociferous about calling for increased spending, increased burden shifting toward our European allies. But I do think that this is something that, if you look back historically, I think even going back as far as President Carter, you can find instances of American presidents calling for Europe to do more. They were just a lot more muted about it. So I don't think it got as much traction, especially given the perception that the Russian threat had sort of tapered off at the time. I think the reason I say we should focus collectively, and again, I really do include the US in this, on the Russian threat, is I think that even if we assume that there is a sustained level of US commitment going forward, that does not absolve NATO of the challenges that it has relative to Russia. Even, of course, the picture gets significantly rosier if the US is all in. However, I think in the areas we heard about defense industrial base capacity, defense spending, because the 5% target declared at the Hague Summit is definitely a step in the right direction, but and I'm not an economist, so I will defer on this one to those on the panel that have more knowledge in that sense. But even just looking at the viability of reaching
5% across the board. I think that is going to be a gigantic struggle, especially looking at sort of debt to GDP ratios and what the EU finds acceptable. The list goes on of the challenges, and we haven't even really touched on the operational challenges yet in terms of getting the right, well, I guess we started to allude to the sort of the right systems on board fast enough, the inherent interoperability challenges that exist. Having 32 countries, both our greatest strength and our greatest weakness, because we inherently have to be interoperable, whereas Russia just has to deal primarily with itself. And then there's also the questions that we haven't delved into in terms of force sourcing and ensuring we have the right forces in the right place. And I know that's something that in Finland resonates a lot because somebody mentioned it at the outset, Finland has one of the largest militaries in terms of wartime strength readiness in NATO, and you are on the front line. So these are all vulnerabilities as far as I look at it, and I think things that we collectively need to address in addition to trying to figure out, as we were sort of joking prior to this, what sort of the best way of getting the administration on board would be. I think the better focus would be, let's look at where there are vulnerabilities, even with US presence, and target those as immediate priorities.
I want to come back to the question in a second, but Jana caught my eye.
Yeah, because it sounds so nice to focus collectively on the shared Russian threat, but I think it doesn't make sense to pretend that this is still the case. And I just give you a couple of examples. I mean, I was struck by Secretary of State Marco Rubio's interview where he basically said, well, how the war in Ukraine ends does not affect an American citizen. It does not change the life of a housewife in Iowa, but it very much changes the life of, I think, the nations that would be much closer to Russian troops. And I think what we've seen from the US administration so far is exactly that this collective threat is not felt any longer, and that the Euro-Atlantic security landscape is split into a European security landscape and an American or US security landscape. And I think that is actually what we've also, I mean, it was papered over during the NATO summit. President Trump signed the declaration, but now the Russia's threat is a half sentence in this communique. It's not front and center, but for the Europeans, it is. I mean, we are not always reacting as if it was. We talk about existential, but then nobody wants to really invest skin in the game, as we now see with this reassurance force. But I think that is actually the real problem. The real problem is that many Europeans believe that if Ukraine falls, their country might be next. And in the United States, at least this administration does not believe in this domino theory. And I've heard them saying this to me out loud. And I think that is basically the problem we are facing, that we are no longer able to look at a shared Russian threat.
Actually, do respond, and then Sylvie wants to come as well. A reminder that this isn't Carolina.
And it's not against you.
No. And if I could just, a quick response. So, I mean, I totally take your points. I do think, though, that within Europe, you alluded to it, there's been a disconnect between rhetoric and implementation and action. And I would push back a little bit on the idea that all of Europe sees the Russian threat with the acute nature that obviously Finland, the Baltics, Poland, increasingly Germany as well does. And I think that's really what I'm alluding to in terms of getting all of the Europeans on the same page, because in order to go at it, which I again hope does not happen, but in order to think about where to or how to approach vulnerabilities as Europe separate from the US, as the framing we were given in the beginning, I think that really starts with getting all of Europe truly on the same page. And I think that there is a deep disconnect within Europe, in addition to what you alluded to with the US dynamic and Europe. So
fair point.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I wanted to complete what Sienna said, and in French I would say, I will mettre les pieds dans le plat, say something really disturbing. If you have a look about the current situation of Europe, and when I say the current situation, this is with the Trump administration, I think we are strongly than ever in a sort of strategic isolation. If you have a look to the war in Ukraine, there is two countries in that world that I won't say have interest that the war in Ukraine continue, but they take a lot of advantage of that war in Ukraine. This is China and the US. In the case of China, in both cases, with China and the US, why do they take benefits from the war? Because that war allowed them to vassalize two countries or two kind of countries. This is Russia for China, this is Europe for the US. And saying that, you have to have in mind that they have a lot of interest in that vassalization. Just have a look to the July trade deal between US and Europe. We signed that deal because of the war in Ukraine and because we need insurance that the US will still support, help us and guarantee us that they will still stay in NATO, you see? And that's the same for Russia and China. Then saying that, it appears really, really difficult to define in that perspective the transatlantic relationship today, because this is not equality, this is vassalization. Well, I am from the country of de Gaulle, and he used to say that we need to be allied, not aligned. I think today we are aligned. I'm not sure it will allow us to stay allied. And that's not my words, that was the words of Donald Trump during his first mandate. And that's really important to have that in mind, I think.
Sylvia, I want to pick on that. And actually, this was the question I was wanting to ask you to tee up the last few minutes of our discussion. There's a sense that Europe needs to do Europe. And European leaders say that as keenly as plenty of Americans. But the challenge is that the US interest in the Euro-Atlantic has been because over the last sort of 50 years, that's been its principal challenge to its security and or 70 years, to its security and to its economic prosperity. When the US principal challenge is coming from China, pause, and accepting that in Ukraine there are North Korean soldiers, Iranian-designed drones, and plenty of Chinese support. So there's already an interconnectedness between the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic. The Chinese threat is already here in Europe physically, as well as plenty of economic and espionage threat too. To what degree can Europe continue to cut its own path in its relationship with China without further impacting on how the US sees the Euro-Atlantic, the transatlantic relationship?
I do think that's a really difficult challenge to navigate, sort of a tightrope, because on the one hand, I know there's a discussion about some countries feeling that if they don't dedicate sort of hard defense assets toward a hypothetical fight with China, that might sway US opinion otherwise. I think the bigger specter right now is the economic policy toward China. 100%. And I think that's actually where it should be. I think a lot of the discussions over, should Europe contribute in terms of hard military assets to an Indo-Pacific fight is misplaced. I think, first of all, there are very few European countries that actually have the capability to do that. I think, secondly, that's not something that the US, and since I'm not Caroline Levitt, I actually don't say this officially, but I don't think that that's something that the US would prefer, simply because it doesn't make a lot of logistical sense. And I don't think that's what the call is for. I do think that because from the US standpoint, of course, and again, not speaking from the administration, but sort of a US defense analyst standpoint, looking at the problem set, to your point, James, they are incredibly interconnected, not just Russia and China, but you also alluded to Iran, and then there's increasing North Korean interplay as well. So sort of the four named US threats. I think it's difficult for the US, given our look at China as the pacing threat, to sort of divorce Europe's outlook on China from what our concerns are with regard to that threat. So I do think there is an element of trying to find alignment there. And I think that is actually much more challenging, ironically, than on the Russia threat, just because there are such deep economic ties with so many European economies and China. It's a problem the US faces as well, obviously, when it comes to trying to figure out a way to sanction your way out of the problem. So that, I think, is an area of definite tension going forward, because I know for many European countries, to include Germany as well, of course, given your economic ties with China, it's going to be something very difficult to square.
Sylvie, Matti, I want to ask you all very briefly. We've only got 5 minutes before someone presses the red button and we all get launched out through the ceiling. But should European trade and economic policy towards China be moderated to maintain the US interest in Euro-Atlantic security? Sylvie.
That's a really good question, and I'm not sure to have the answer because, well, I think we have to improve our autonomy, our sovereignty, and it means probably also to decide what may be our partner in defense, in economy, etc., depending on our interests. But I'm not sure that it is really easy in Europe to define one European interest in reality. And bargaining with the US or bargaining with China will imply different national interests, and that's the difficulty in reality. Moreover, all the other questions we may have concerning value, human rights, etc., etc. But that's a really good issue, and I think we may begin to try to answer that question.
Matti?
Maybe not that much to add to that question, but on like European role in the Indo-Pacific. So to me, it's quite clear the primary focus of Europeans should be in Europe, because playing a decisive and a meaningful role in the Indo-Pacific, I think, is far less important than ensuring that deterrence in Europe holds, and particularly if a crisis erupts in the Indo-Pacific, because there is also that potential risk of a coordinated aggression, and in such scenario, Europe would bear the main responsibility for maintaining European defense and deterrence. So that's why the focus should ideally be in Europe, particularly for the bigger players that play a major role in European defense: Germany, France, UK.
I remember Ken Brathwaite, who was the ambassador to Norway in the Trump's first administration. He pointed out to me that in terms of a northern sea route through the Arctic, the first Western stop after Japan was the Norwegian coast, which I just thought was a really interesting illustration of the way the two theatres come together as that sea route opens. But Jana, Germany, I know you're not here to represent Germany per se, but Germany is a massive global trading nation, enormous manufacturing base that relies on exports, and China is a hugely important market. How will the Chancellery feel if a future US administration starts to demand that the return for US investment in European security is a more US-facing trade policy?
You know, I think I would turn this around. Why should we be more critical with China or more hawkish towards China? Not because the United States asks us to be on their side, but because we have an own interest to see China more clear-eyed, to reduce our dependencies. If we are serious that this war against Ukraine is not only about Ukraine, but about the European security order more broadly, then China is the central enabler of this war. China makes this war possible on a daily basis. So China is working actively against us and against our interests, and we have not made China feel this way. I think in that sense, Donald Trump had a point when he was asking the Europeans for more sanctions. I think we have not started an honest discussion about how should we deal with a China that is actually enabling Russia's war and what can we do against it. And we should think about sanctions because it's in our interest, because it's our security, and not to do a favor to the United States.
Well put. Isa, I want to come to you with the last question of all. We've only got about a minute left. There are people in the UK MOD and in fact in NATO headquarters who are using 2028, 2029 as a date by which Europe, NATO must be as ready as possible. Now, I think that that is just a forcing function. I don't think there's intelligence to say that war is coming that soon. But as a chief executive of a major defence company, can you honestly tell us that Europe has the industrial capacity to be ready on that timeline?
Not totally. Not in every area. Well, there are pockets where that level is already there. But in a total, so I would say that the clock is ticking. It's only 2-3 years. And knowing, I'll just give one example. If somebody decides to build an ammunition facility, production facility, decision made today, if there are no hiccups and everything goes like in a movie, it's a minimum of 3 to 4 years before it's operational, maybe even 5. So that's a reality. Then there are areas where decisions are by far much faster. And then we are just talking about ramping up the capabilities of something the companies are already producing today. So developing new capabilities and so forth, so that's another story. So yes, as a total, we are in a hurry.
And the danger is that on this stage last year and the year before and the year before, there was the same cri de coeur around what the lead-in times are, and yet here we are. And if the producers wanted to be really mean, they would mash all of those clips together and show them next year after the same argument has been made again. Esa, Sylvie, Ashley, Matti, Jana, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I hope you enjoyed the discussion as much as I did. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Olisiko Karo halunnut mukaan?
Kyllä se voi tuossa on kuiskaana tuossa.
Niin.
Onko tämä mikki päällä? Ei ole päällä. Okay. Hello everyone. Welcome to the last session of the day. It is my true pleasure to introduce my wonderful panelists. We have Mikko Hautala, the Chief Geopolitical and Government Relations Officer and Country Manager for Nokia Finland, and Sauli Eloranta, the Vice President of Defense at the Technical Research Center of Finland, VTT. So please join me in welcoming Sauli and Mikko. So this session is all about how we're actually using technologies in defense. And Sauli, maybe you could give us an overview. What is happening today in the defense sector, and what kind of technologies are we actually seeing?
Okay, thank you, Melissa. So I think what's coloring our view on tech today is really the happenings in Ukraine, and what we've seen in the past couple of years or 3 years of the very rapid acceleration of adoption of new technologies. Also a kind of improvised use of technologies, harnessing a lot of commercial off-the-shelf things when it comes to, let's say, communication, using Elon Musk's satellites, for enhanced communications when the other means have not been usable, developing drones and so on. So I think, it really differs from what the long-term view for defense technologies would be. We heard from Commissioner Virkkunen about AI and quantum and microchips and space and what have you. So they are not maybe as relevant yet in today's, let's say, acute situation what we see. But I would say that technology certainly has taken kind of the driver's seat when it comes to reacting to all kind of new threats at the moment. So the established, let's say, means of kinetic impact and all, they will remain. But at the side of that, when there has not been enough of means for, let's say, volume-based battle, then you have to kind of try to move into a new direction, which is more maybe smart and more improvised and more fast.
And you've spoken a lot about how basically everything changed for you after the Ukraine war. And we've now entered this new paradigm of defense. Can you talk a bit about what that is?
Well, we've been using the term new defense, and maybe it's good to share with all of you also here. And I think that most of you are familiar with new space or new space economy, where companies like Elon Musk's companies and ICEYE in Finland, what have you, entered the, very, let's say, administration-heavy space market maybe 15 years ago or so. But now what's happening in the defense market, this new defense means that there will be a lot of new entrants to the market, and a lot of things are changing. It's a paradigm shift and systemic change. So instead of having very long-term development cycles in technology, let's say 10 to 20 year cycles, very administration-heavy, administration steered and predetermined results, we have then moved into something where we have a lot of new companies. These startups that we also heard earlier today, they want to enter the defense market. And these drones in Ukraine are just one kind of small sign of that. But that's, when we enter more into this discussion, I would love to discuss also how this would be an opportunity for Europe. I mean, this disruption in the approach could be really an opportunity for all of us.
I promise you we'll get to that. But before that, Mikko, I want to hear what you guys are doing in defense.
Yeah, thanks. Before going into defense directly, I would perhaps bring back up the concept of national security, which is broader. And obviously, if you don't have national security in the broader sense secured, then of course your defense rests on a very shaky ground. So what I mean by this is that if you look at Europe these days, we do have massive problems in our digital infrastructure. One of the problems is that it's already part of the infrastructure is in the hands of, as we call it in our lingo, non-trusted vendors. So we actually don't have the full control of the technology stack, which always means that it's more open and vulnerable to sort of bad intentions and actions. So basically, I think we have to have a broader view on European defense and tech, and one of the cornerstones, foundations, is actually the critical infrastructure and digital infrastructure, because without these, you basically don't really have a reliable, sustainable defense. On the defense side, I think the fundamental driver behind what the organization that I do represent is the AI supercycle. And AI supercycle means that AI will obviously occupy more and more space in all areas of life, including defense. And AI supercycle means that actually data traffic globally is going to double at least, probably triple, within the next 10 years. And it's mainly driven by AI use, but it also means for us that AI doesn't work, it doesn't really mean much without the corresponding connectivity that actually makes sure that the data can be moved from a device to a data center and then back. And I'll just give you an example. For a European customer right now, 1 gigabit per second is considered internet is really working nice. If you have AI functions, you have to be able to move 800 gigabits per second. So it means that the level of connectivity that you need to run your economy or operate in the military domain, you actually have to be able to move massively more, faster, low latency. So that's the basic case, that how do you bring the AI to defense? And if you want to do that, and you actually have to do it, you have to also have the connectivity, which is able to uphold the system.
And so, that's really interesting. I want to definitely talk about critical infrastructure, but I'm really interested in Nokia's role currently. What kind of technologies are you providing for the technology sector?
We are currently active in, I would say, 3 operational or domains. We are, of course, bringing connectivity to the strategic level. It can mean in defense context, military base, sort of defense data center. Then we, of course, bring the connectivity to operational side, like moving bigger troops, forward deployed areas. Then we also have the tactical bubble, so we can bring the smallest version we have is actually a 5G independent network in your backpack, weighing like 7-8 kilos. So that's the kind of smallest critical 5G bubble you can bring. Why this is all important? Because if we assume, and I think it's correct to assume, that AI systems are going to be decisive in the battlefield. And like I said earlier, they need massively faster data transfer. You actually, the old radios, as we call them, old green radios, they simply cannot, they are made for voice. They are not made for the data sort of volumes we are now talking about. So actually you need new sort of concepts, you need new technologies. And what we are bringing is 5G. It's actually, that is the only standard currently that can really, it gives you 10 times the speed of the old systems at least. So this is the kind of the basic argument we have. Then I would also add here that we are now moving towards 6G in mobile networks. That's going to happen in the next 5 years commercially. We are now setting the standards, and that will probably mean that the network itself will become a national defense tool, because network will have capabilities of sensing. It essentially becomes a radar. It can see, analyze, detect things that it cannot today. So this will also mean that the network doesn't only kind of enable operations within the network bubble, but it actually becomes a defensive tool in itself. So these are the long-term opportunities that we do have.
That's fascinating. I mean, just this June, NATO adopted a new 6G standard. I mean, what is it? What is the significance of that?
Well, we are having a process of basically competing about who gets to set the standard for 6G. And obviously the aim is that all the different players in the field, we could agree on a common standard so that all the equipment devices would be then compatible. We are not there yet. The process is ongoing. But it's obviously important that NATO actually in June this year adopted 5G as a military standard. So it means that it basically acknowledged that this is usable, viable for military use.
I want to pick up on something you said earlier about AI, and I'm really interested in hearing it. How do you see AI changing the nature of warfare? And AI, not just ChatGPT, but in the broadest sense. Sauli, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's unavoidable. So that if you think of our pockets, we have mobile phones in our pockets, and they have, let's say, all kind of computer vision and shape recognition. They will kind of pinpoint your friends by name, and they know from every one of your tens of thousands of photos. They know better than yourself, you know, who was who in what given time. So it's something that you cannot really stop the trend. And then I think that there is also quite a lot of talk about autonomous systems, and drones, you know, are still quite a lot of, let's say, remotely controlled in a way that there is an operator, and there are some mishaps with that, so that you know, they are very vulnerable to jamming and what have you. So more autonomous systems can maybe operate when you are losing the connection. So that might be one kind of thing in there. And normally, if you have autonomy, you need to do that through artificial intelligence. Then soldiers typically want to have a human in the loop or on the loop and not off the loop, so that we would like to have a soldier deciding what to do. But I mean, that's also relative, so that now in Ukraine, so they want to design drones that maybe the last 50 to 100 meters are autonomous sliding into the target, you know, when, you know, the jamming is at its strongest. So therefore, you know, I would not like to consider that a black and white question, you know, whether you go for AI or you don't go, but it will start. And for my sake, I think that, you know, this soppatykki in Finnish, I mean, this soup cannon, you know, which is bringing pea soup to soldiers, might also be one of the first ones that should be autonomized, and not maybe the most lethal things. But I mean, if you're very categorized, then you don't want even to have this soup cannon, you know, to drive by itself to front line. But I mean, it's all relative, so you have to start from easiest areas of applications.
Sauli, thanks for the business idea, Nokia autonomous soup cannon.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay, we need to IP protect that right now.
That sounds like an excellent idea. Help me put the recent news around drones into context. How worried should we be about this new technology?
Now, the thing what we should be worried about, I think it's the commander of Finnish Defence Forces was also highlighting this in the news earlier this week, that it's the cost imbalance that we have at the moment. So that the threat is caused by relatively inexpensive means. And on the other hand, the countermeasures are done with extremely expensive means. So therefore, if you think of war economy, I mean, this is entirely unsustainable. So we need to learn from, let's say, the use of drones in Ukraine about how you can manufacture in industrial scale something that could counter, let's say, those threats what we see at the moment. And I would highlight that probably we can never put all those counter things on a shelf like we have wanted to do with 155mm artillery grenades. But it might be such a fast-moving target that we just have to start to build capability to meet those things. So therefore, this technical capability would be starting from, let's say, gifted individuals, you know, suitable companies with suitable backgrounds, and training, you know, like being prepared and increased preparedness by creating projects that are doing that to some scale. But what we've seen, for example, in Ukraine is that first, you know, you have objects that are coming very slowly, then they are putting some jet engines into those things, and they are coming very fast. And first they come so that you can jam them, and then they come, you know, having this fiber optic cable behind them, and you cannot jam them, and it changes a matter of weeks and months. So therefore, you know, we need to just, you know, I think Europe needs to, let's say, just harness the civilian sector, technology sector better to do that. And if you think of, I mean, Nokia is hardly a defense company, but it's an excellent example of a dual-use company that all the technologies can be also used for security and defense. Therefore, the companies like Nokia's and even the small startup companies would be the ones that I would opt for, making this change, rather than the present, let's say, missile companies. That if I say that your missile price should go to 1% of the original price, I think that they would not go for it as a good business model. But it has to be 1/100th of the original price at the moment. What we see.
Excellent. Mikko, can you tell us how are you thinking about this and shifting from a company that operates in peacetime to potentially wartime?
Well, basically, Nokia has been in the defense for decades. When the mobile networks and phones came, it kind of was forgotten for some time, but it never went really away. So it's been always there. Like Sauli said, we've been always providing this technology for defense purposes. What is different now is that we see the need for this massive data transfer capacity also in tactical setting in the battlefield. It has to reflect the need for data that you have there. So this is perhaps something new, and this is something that we are currently busy with. I would simply say here in this context that that's what Sauli said. I totally agree with the aspect that instead of trying to figure out what we do need exactly now and produce that, a lot of that, I think it's far more better and far more important actually to really build up a long-term technological capability so that you will be able to address whatever the shape or form of the threat in next 10 years, 20 years is. So there's no fixed solution to this. It has to be a kind of it's a moving target by definition. Then I think in the context of Ukraine, I've been trying to study it hard and being there, trying to understand what is the critical kind of a lesson for us. I think it's not only technological capability, it's actually part of the capability is that how do the companies and Ukrainian armed forces work together? Because the old practice used to be that you have armed forces, you have companies, then you have a massive layer of bureaucracy and process in between those two things. And I think by European standards, the quick process was 7 years. And now you have a completely different situation so that instead of having this kind of insulation between companies and defense forces, they actually have to work together from day one. And they have to make the new iteration, they have to find a new solution, they have to update things in a matter of weeks instead of like having the formal process of years. I think this is going to be quite difficult for Europeans since we don't have the urgency, the absolute urgency of a wartime when you can actually easily kind of throw away all the layers of kind of purchasing rules. So I think we have to learn to be faster, but the critical thing is that armed forces and companies have to be, they actually have to not only collaborate, but actually co-create, because that's the only way of really moving fast enough in this field.
May I comment? I mean, even though we are now talking and having a European viewpoint at the moment, so what we've seen lately in NATO, and most of the European countries are NATO countries, so there are some fabulous new processes in NATO that have been launched very recently, like in June this year. So, for example, Rapid Adaptation Action Plan, RAAP, which means that there are exactly those elements what Mikko was highlighting, that there is a faster route, for the companies to get insight from the defense forces or NATO forces, what the needs would be. There would be also some support for the companies, to recognize companies that startups and tech companies that have something good to give, and faster access to, for example, field testing or other things. And then Finland also declared at the same time in the summer a NATO innovation range, which would be established in Finland, and that is actually highlighting next generation communications. I mean, we're a Nokia country, Nordics are Nokia and Ericsson countries, so next generation communication is very natural technological choice for us, so that no question about it. And also talking about NATO, so Finland is now starting its first NATO Diana accelerator next year. So Diana is a kind of a system that there are more than 1,000 or 2,000 applicants, companies, and that have technical ideas, and they are approaching NATO, and NATO is filtering out 97% of them as waste, and 3% are coming into this program. Now, we have had 4 Finnish companies so far in that NATO system, and next year, let's see how many we are getting. But, it's less than 100 companies annually that are getting a training where military soldiers are telling what they need, investors are telling how you build up your company, and tech people are saying how you should increase your technology readiness level in your thing. So my message for Europe would be that, let's utilize NATO to Europe's advantage, because we mentioned US and something also about, let's say, Far East today. US interest is maybe not in land battle in the same way as in Europe. So if you think of all these, let's say, communication things, drones and other things what we have been discussing today, they are very European issues. So therefore, if we operate within NATO and concentrate our forces in these, let's say, topics that are very relevant to Europe, then we are combining our needs to, let's say, some well-functioning mechanisms. And I don't downplay any European mechanisms, but the European Defence Fund, European UDIS, others, they are not maybe as mature or as impactful as some of these NATO things. In some cases they are.
Mikko, did you have something to add?
Perhaps I would simply take a jump to a more kind of a strategic concern that I have, because I'm actually less concerned of the European capability of handling with the defense tech and kind of, I think we have the industry, we are capable of scaling it up. So we have all those ingredients in place to tackle with the immediate kind of short-term, middle-term threats. I think what is more fundamental is that the reality is that Europe is massively lacking in its digital capabilities. And I'll give an example from my world. The share of the 5G standalone networks in Europe is 2%. And what does 5G standalone mean? It means that the whole network in all its elements is designed for 5G standard, which is the fastest that you can have right now. In China, the role of fully fledged 100% 5G systems is 80%. So in our case, 2%, China 80%. So basically everybody is surpassing Europe in that respect. And this does mean that we simply don't have the digital infrastructure to build an AI-based economy and also defense on it. And how do you ramp this fundamental thing up fast enough? I don't think I have an answer. I think Europeans did wake up on this at least a year ago with the Draghi report. But the fundamental threat here is that unless Europe catches up, it will mean that we will progressively lag behind more and more and more. And why this is important in defense context as well, it's because I think it was one of the pre-events where it was said really clearly, and I think I do agree with that, that technological dominance in the AI world will equal to military dominance. So if we don't have the ingredients, the basic infrastructure to succeed in the AI world, whatever the kind of practical solutions at some point will be, I think we have a massive problem in our hands, and this needs to be addressed. Then everything else can be built upon that.
But what do you mean? Does that mean Europeans building their own large language models, or concretely, what would that mean?
I'll give you an example. It starts from even data center capacity that we have, which is clearly different from for example, US. It also specifically, for me, it means the lack of connectivity. Like I said, Europe, 2% poor 5G systems, China 80%. It may sound like it doesn't matter much, so Chinese will simply get their cat videos faster. No, it will matter massively. So it's about really the infrastructure. Our problem also in this respect is that we don't have incentives in Europe to really invest heavily. I'll give another example. US operator typically who invest in these networks, they have 100 million subscribers. Average European operator has 4 million subscribers. So talk about scale here.
Sally, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
It's a grim picture. I mean, I'm struggling to try to find, let's say, a silver lining, to this thing, and I'm personally very concerned about.
I have solution.
Okay. Well, that's positive, but save it to the later stage. I think one example what VTT has been doing is that, for example, in Finland, the investments in strategic technologies like quantum have been kind of centralized or focused somewhere. VTT is not really kind of holding a quantum computer in its, let's say, basement and holding it for itself. Now, we have had like hundreds of millions of euros of investments into these startups and new companies that are kind of rising. That is a follow-up of the strategic investment. So rather than having, let's say, every town to have 1 qubit computer, so we are having 50 to 300 qubit computers that are central investments. And we have this Lumi computer, supercomputer that we discussed and heard from Commissioner Virkkunen. So that might be something that we have to do more. And it's also painful for smaller nations like Finland to say that, okay, Europe opts for more centralized solutions, because Finland as a marginal, thing in the outskirts normally is not getting everything, by definition. But that's unfortunately, I guess, or fortunately, I guess that's what we have to do. And I mean, going back to the physical world once, if you think of the number of platforms that we have in European, let's say, defense systems, they're like immense. There are tens of different platforms for tanks or aircraft or what have you, compared to US, where there is a consolidation and focus. So therefore, you can make better choices. So I guess Europe needs to pick up its battles. I think the consumer business has gone. I don't know, I'm sorry. But I mean, it could be that, the remaining option could be that if we could manage the data for more tailored or business-driven or sector-specific things, that could be one chance, because there's nobody really collecting wise data about the battlefield. So in Finland, the winters are every year, and we could collect all kind of thing and teach the AI about anything what you can see in the snow and be prepared and what have you. But I don't think we do that much. So therefore, all the data is from consumers, and all the consumer data goes to US and China, and it's not really going to go to Europe in any greater sense. But, I'm trying to find the silver lining in a way that there are some specific areas where we could be much stronger, as a power.
I'd love to hear from both of you. How do we fix this critical infrastructure dependency or problem that we have? How do we make that more sovereign? Mikko?
I think we have to take a look at the European regulation in order to allow for more scale. That means cross-border mergers. That means like allowing companies to grow bigger. Then obviously we need to support R&D pretty massively. And I think we have to, of course, focus on the areas where we still do have a chance. And my kind of a sobering analysis, you can contest that, but we do have only a handful of globally critical companies in Europe left. You have ASML, which is making those basically chips. Then you have Nokia and Ericsson. One of the few examples where also the US is kind of dependent on Europe and not the other way around. Then you have like perhaps Airbus, SAP, things like that. So I think the connectivity is obviously one of those fields where we still do matter more than anywhere else. So I think we have to pick up our battles, like Sauli said, and think meaningfully where we can make a difference. But currently the problem is that, like I said, we need to invest heavily in R&D. We have to allow the market to grow bigger, to invest, to really invest in scale, because otherwise it will lead to a situation where we simply kind of continue to lag behind. We can't scale things up. And it gets more dangerous now when AI supercycle is going on.
Maybe one pass to Mikko again, so that I know that in Finnish media there was one quite recent article by our former CEO Antti Vasara from VTT, Pekka Lundmark, the previous CEO for Nokia, and Peter Sarlin from Silo AI. And they were kind of bringing up an idea that, for example, in next generation communications, it's not only about communications. I'm sure that Nokia would not like to only transfer kind of contaminated messages, contaminated data which is compromised in security and cyber and what have you. And what those guys were saying, those, let's say, 3 leading tech guys in Finland were saying that, you know, when you have this new combination of next generation communications with cyber and AI and quantum and space, you are kind of redefining the place. It's a bit like a blue ocean strategy, so that, you know, we are maybe behind in many of those things, but we have all the freedom to redefine what would be the future concept of trusted communications. And for me, I'm trying to find a name, whatever, diamond or fireball or rock or whatever that would be, but something that would kind of say that, you know, whatever is going there, it's resilient and it's trusted and it flows and it's shareable and what have you. But that's something I think, like, my main takeout from, I think it was like 3 weeks ago when this article was, that this could be an option. And companies like Nokia would have the industrial, let's say, muscle also to take it that count. So in that sense, you know, I think that there's always a way forward for us. But we also might need to change the rules of the game sometimes, you know, when we want to play to our advantage.
Mm. When you think about AI, I mean, until now, Europe's approach has been very much to focus on the ethical side and make sure it's responsible. Do you think by doing that, Europe has sort of shot itself in the foot?
Yeah, the ethics of AI is something that typically people are very concerned about, you know, what the kind of the autonomous machine is doing, you know, what the computer is doing when it thinks by itself. And let's say 5 years back, it was always about, you know, a car, you know, trying to opt for, you know, by hitting 1 person or 2 persons or what have you. And I think that one thing is that we need to accept that that Europe should be driving regulation for ethical and trustworthy AI as it is doing now. So therefore, you know, the public acceptance of more autonomous systems and the kind of infiltration of AI in all our lives will be somehow manageable. But then there's another ethical question. I don't know if it's a good time to bring that up, but it's also about, you know, when we talk about the ethics of this whole defense thing, you know, what we're doing here, why we are sitting here with Mikko today. And for me, I have been trying to tell to myself that, you know, unfortunately, it's an ethical imperative also that we are sitting here today. So we would maybe not like to be talking about defense issues as much as we do today. But, you know, our, let's say, democracy-based, you know, societies are now under existential threat. So therefore, that's one ethical dimension. That's why we have to do this. And the other ethical dimension is that sometimes, you know, it's better to have a machine helping an elderly person rather than no person at all. And I also learned from one of the Finnish politicians, she might be here today, I don't recall anymore who she was, but was from a kind of a more remote part of Finland. And we're talking about ferry traffic that could be autonomized. And she said that, well, that's a perfect ethical thing, that people can stay longer. They can live out in the islands, you know, they can keep the island inhabited because the cost level of this unmanned system is better than with a manned system. But you have to still do the ethical part, but people can trust that it's safe to ride on those things. I don't know if that answered to you, but
brilliant analysis. I'd like to take some audience questions here. We have Mike, please, could we get one here?
Quite readily audible without a mic as well, but maybe, is this being streamed? Wonderful.
Yes.
So my name is Vili Lehdonvirta. I'm professor of technology policy at Aalto University. So thank you for the very interesting remarks. If Europe cannot develop domestic AI, frontier AI capabilities, should we still adopt AI across society and let it infiltrate into every aspect of society, as you've suggested? Thank you.
Yes.
That's a very Finnish answer.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate, please?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, you cannot neglect AI because, like what Mikko was saying, everything is about data, and you know how the data is kind of being a part of our lives, and all the systems will be, let's say, more connected, more let's say cognitive and what have you. So therefore, we have to be good in adapting AI. No question about it. But probably the big, let's say, owners of AI data models and big servers and what have you, they might be a different ball game. But adapting that, for example, in defense, we can be leaders in that, no question.
Even if that means we are even more dependent on foreign tech.
Just to repeat that for people in the live stream, he asked, even if that means that we're more dependent on foreign tech companies.
Why not thinking of a risk-based approach, so that consider that you make dumb systems in order to avoid your dependency on US, let's say, tech. I would opt for going to wise systems or smart systems, but it's something that you have to kind of consider. If you want to just, for political reasons to let's say reduce your dependency, and at the same time your product range would be dumber, then probably it would not be wise. But it's not a clear balance.
I would say that if we somehow kind of decide not to adopt AI, I propose that we all start to retrain ourselves as museum guides.
Yeah.
Okay, love the questions. We have a lady here in the middle, please.
So I'm Paula Vanninen from University of Helsinki and associate professor. I'm interested about these ethical rules which you were saying. I give you an example that we can create a lot of new drug candidates for the medicines via AI. We get the properties which we want to get the new drugs. And then on the other hand, we can also create a lot of toxic chemicals which can be used, for example, as chemical weapons or perhaps even biological weapons. So how could you rule these, that ethical rules, that can you guide to the computer, supercomputer, that if there is something wrong started to do with somebody, it says, no, we don't do this? Or have you any ideas about this? Because we know that mainly for the military purposes, the aim is to kill people and to protect your own country. But where are these, how to create these ethical rules there? Is it only in the person's minds and the governments, or what? How do you think about it? Is it possible even?
I mean, maybe a dull answer would be that pretty much all the technologies could be having malicious uses as well. So communication could be, let's say, disinformation or miscommunication and all those. One thing is that if we are, as a mankind, we are winning by harnessing AI into medicines development and all of that. So that has value. So that is saving lives. So maybe you have to, again, a bit balancing like we're discussing earlier on the ethical issues. So it would be quite dangerous to start from a fact that you are, let's say, slowing down or creating, let's say, so much regulation that you are actually slowing down also the positives. So I learned some years back that, for example, in the German automotive some sort of alliance, there was an ethical guideline that it is an ethical imperative to take new technology into use if it has been proven to be safer than existing solutions, which is quite an unorthodox thinking that you have a responsibility and accountability to actually harness AI if you can prove that it actually is having positive impact.
I think I can't claim being any expert on this field, but I would simply assess that obviously when you harness the AI for doing good in the society, you will have the other side of the coin as well. And obviously you can try to regulate that with ethical rules, even legislation. The difficulty here is that because AI is at front and center of the global power competition, so how do you make those powers who want to gain more power and challenge the others, how do you regulate them to stop this kind of weaponizing of the AI? So this is the dilemma where even a democratic rule of law country will be and will have to face. So I think the discussion is going to be like, shall we simply go further? Shall we even weaponize the AI? Shall we plan for how to use it for those kind of purposes with the hope of finding a balance so that nobody can sort of threaten us with this kind of super capabilities, because we can then counter. It's pretty much the same dynamics as you had with the nuclear weapons back in the day, when actually nobody could really afford of those great powers to stop that. They were rather sort of incentivized to move further. So I'm afraid this might be the logic of the future. I certainly don't hope that, but I think we have to be prepared that something like this will also happen.
Do you think we should have red lines, something that we just won't accept, like autonomous killer robots, for example?
I mean, we can have red lines as many as we please, but the question is that how do we enforce those red lines in the middle of the massive, deep, great power competition? It's not about, it will be about the sort of capabilities. So how do we enforce those? I mean, this is the question we simply can't answer fully, at least.
There's a question over the man with the paper, please.
It's a unique identifier. Thank you. Valtteri Vuoriso, University of Tampere. Thank you for the discussion. And Mikko, I think you raised a brilliant point on highlighting the importance and lack of capability in the European infrastructure from a connectivity point of view. Super important. I would like to also highlight energy and the energy infrastructure. Recent report says that if you want to develop an AI factory, a leading AI factory in the world in 2030, it will cost 200 billion, which is, you know, a lot of money, but can be found, but will require the equivalent amounts of energy from 9 nuclear reactors. 9. So all this talk about, you know, where we want to be a European AI superpower, or Finland wants to be an AI superpower, where do we get the energy? Is this futile talk, and are we just trying to deceive ourselves that we are in the game? Or like Vili said, that we should recognize the dependencies on the technology of the great powers. Thank you.
Thank you. Sauli, do you want to take this?
No real answer to that, Valtteri. So I mean, this whole energy debate is something that it looks like, you know, with the amount of renewables, you know, we are actually being able to meet the normal, let's say, requirements when it comes to European targets, if the technology development goes the way how we see it today with nuclear and wind and solar and what have you. But then if that's an exponential increase in energy consumption, that would require some other things. So normally I guess that in throughout the history, you know, the more you have had energy, the more you have spent it, so that there's never any excess energy in a way that it's all going to be consumed. So the more we are having it, you know, it will find its way to our systems and processes. So one thing is that at least, you know, we have to try to consider this. I would like to combine this energy question that you might now touch from a sustainability point of view into resilience point of view, so that also, you know, if you are building your energy systems, resilient energy systems would be less dependent on fossil fuels and would be more based on, let's say, renewables or what have you, and therefore that would be one option for that. But if you are running, let's say, your AI server farms with fossil fuels, that doesn't seem very clever either, you know, going forward.
I think if you ask Finnish energy companies, they will give you a slide where they can prove that they can scale up the energy production that will cover those needs. I think on your question, probably we have to also keep in mind that you can calculate things assuming that the energy efficiency stays the same in the future. But what if it improves massively? And just to give an example on 6G, we expect that the energy efficiency will drastically improve in the next 10 years. So you may have things in the horizon that would sort of enable you to cover that as well. So we just don't know that.
And maybe quantum computers someday, you know, depending a bit what kind of time frame we have. So there might be some disruptive ways of computing also in the future, but they are not yet today.
Thank you. Any other questions in the audience? Oh, some pointing over here.
So Peter Watkins from Chatham House. Sauli mentioned new defence and drew the parallel with new space. And I just wondered if you could say how quickly you think this transition might occur. I mean, in space it's happening pretty quickly, but I would suggest that in defence it might be a lot more difficult. There are more and bigger and more influential incumbents. There's all sorts of issues, vested interests and so on. So how quickly might it occur and how might it be accelerated?
Thank you. I mean, excellent introduction to the topic, and those are the kind of things that are actually, let's say, you know, really hindering, you know, this type of thing. Like I said, NATO and many nations have new methods and tools to try to, let's say, attract more companies coming into the market. I would say it takes a long time. And when it comes to space, you know, it's not that massive. I mean, it's been massive for the past maybe 5 years or so, mainly from American companies and let's say really the small companies like we have ICE in Finland. Now they have 800 people and I don't recall how many satellites they have. But it has taken a long, long time for them also to grow. I think it will be the same in defense as well. So one main thing in that new defense is that do we have to kind of channel all the new entrance to the market through existing incumbents? And I think that the existing companies, established defense companies, might be filtering a bit. You know, it might not be in their interest to disrupt their own business, right? You know, if you want to get, let's say, a disruption in cost level, so then you might need to create a challenger. I mean, that's what happened pretty much in the space industry, that you have a different cost level with these new operators. So therefore, they might need to go to the market directly. And then again, like, I mean, we're here with Nokia. I mean, Nokia has, let's say, also products that they can export to defense market directly, not always using a prime or an integrator in between, but of course, in many cases, yes. So I'm just thinking that how can we kind of make it sure that the large industrial primes are not starting to be blockers for new technology introduction, but many times also the administrations that are acquiring new technology, they can also set all kind of rules also what they want to have. They might set a cost level target or let's say availability target or tech target or what have you. So maybe they have some ways of directing this. So no clear answer. I would say that it will take a long time before these small companies are coming. We have been analyzing this Finnish dual use or new defense landscape with like roughly 200 companies. And they are growing much faster than existing companies. Like we had Patria CEO Esa Rautalinko here today. I mean, the growth of these small companies is extensive, but they are starting from near zero. So it will take a long time before they are new Patrias or Airbuses or what have you. Creating a new Airbus will take 20 years, so I think. Even though we have companies like Palantir, you know, those are kind of interesting, but they are exactly the type of companies what Mikko was bringing up that are not from this let's say, continent. But these database companies can come into 10 billion, let's say, range just not overnight, but let's say within a couple of years, but not in Europe.
Thank you, Sauli. We have a couple of minutes left, and I want to give you both a final task. I want to know from you, what is the most important thing Europe can do to future-proof its defense sector? And you both have 30 seconds. Mikko.
Well, I think, that, like I said, the critical thing is to address those foundational problems that we have in our digital infrastructure and build all those models on that. Unless we do so, any subsequent effort we'll do in defense, in any other field, is quite likely to fail because it doesn't have the foundation to build upon.
Thank you. Sauli?
And I would say that beef up the existing defense industry with dual use or civilian industries. I mean, build those nuclear or polar icebreakers for US, you know, export them from Europe to US, you know, safeguard the whole North Pole with, let's say, European technology, you know, export Nokia stuff in there and try to get as much as possible civilian companies to really also learn how to address address the defense market, and not only the defense industrial companies. They know how to do it, but that's where the growth potential is, I think.
Excellent. Thank you so much for both for this fascinating conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today and tuning in for your brilliant questions, and everyone at the live stream as well. That's the wrap for day one. Thank you.